Oh, hello, my colleagues. I want to move on now to corporate bonds. For the most part, we've been talking about default-free bonds, right? So far, and doing arbitrage and zeros with U.S. Treasury securities, right? So we've talked a lot about U.S. Treasuries. So now we're going to talk about corporate bonds. So these are bonds basically issued by corporations, and they could be susceptible to default. The company could go belly up like Enron did. A lot of companies during the pandemic have gone away, right? That is, it may not pay back the full amount promised in the bond prospectus, right, or indenture. So this is known as credit risk, right? If this default, if the company doesn't, pay you, is known as credit risk, and you should get an extra return on that to cover the fact that you're not getting. There's a possibility that the company is going to default or file for bankruptcy. So how does basically credit risk? How does credit risk affect the bond prices and yields? And as you can imagine, it's going to increase, right? So because the cash flows promised by the bond are most that bondholders can hope to receive, the cash flows that a purchaser of a bond with credit risk expects to receive may be less than the amount only because the company can go belly up. You won't get any more, but you could get less. As a result, investors pay less for bonds with credit risk than they would for an otherwise identical default-free bond. Because the yield to maturity for a bond is calculated using the promised cash flows, and if the company doesn't go belly up, you should always get those coupons and hopefully at the end get your money back at the end. The yields of bonds with credit risk will be higher, which should make sense to you, right? Because you're taking more risk, so you should get more return than default-free bonds, which we previously discussed, right? Which we previously discussed. All right, so for a quick review, suppose that the 1-year treasury, a 1-year zero coupon treasury bill has a yield to maturity of 4%. What are the price and yield of a 1-year $1,000 zero coupon bond issued by some company here? Suppose that all investors agree that there is no possibility that Avant will default within the next year. So in that case, investors will receive $1,000 in 1 year with certainty, right? Because there's no chance of default. Because this bond is risk-free, and we go back again to the law of one price, that guarantees that it must have the same yield as the 1-year Treasury zero coupon bond, right? The 1-year zero coupon Treasury bill, right? Which we've gone through already, right? So here's the price of the bond, right? And here's the yield, 4%, right? Did we say 4%? Right there, 4%. So here's the price you would pay for that bond. Now, suppose that investors believe that the company will default. So if it defaults, you're going to pay cheaper. So you're only going to pay 900. So this is smaller, right? Basically, so the present value, what's the present value of this bond? If that's smaller, so even though the bond promises 1,000 at year end, they will only receive only $900 because of a chance of default, right? There may be a chance that the company won't be able to come up with 1,000. They may say, well, we have to give you less. We're only going to give you 900. So you should only pay, because of the risk associated with this bond, you may have to pay only 865.38. All right, so there's a good blurb here, and we should talk about this. Are treasuries really default-free securities? And for the most part, they are. Most investors treat U.S. Treasury securities as risk-free, that there's no chance of default. But are treasuries really risk-free? The answer depends on what you mean by risk-free. Now, there's going to be maturity risk, right? No one can be certain that the U.S. government will never default on its bonds, though there's a pretty good case that they won't. But most people believe that the probability of such events is very small, as we said, right? More importantly, the default probability is smaller than for any other bond. So saying that the yield on a U.S. Treasury security is risk-free really means that the Treasury security is the lowest risk investment denominated in U.S. dollars in the world. That said, there have been occasions in the past where Treasury holders did not receive exactly what they promised. So we got to go way back. In 1790, Alexander Hamilton lowered the interest rate on outstanding debt. And then in 1933, I guess during the Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt suspended bondholders' right to be paid in gold rather than currency, right? So in 2011, when a series of large budget deficits brought the U.S. up against the debt ceiling, a constraint imposed by Congress limiting the overall amount of debt the government can incur, an act of Congress was required by August 2011 for the Treasury to meet its obligations and avoid a default. In response to the political uncertainty back then, whether or not the ceiling would be raised, Standard & Poor's downgraded its rating on U.S. government bonds. Congress ultimately raised the debt ceiling and no default occurred. Given persistent budget deficits, similar debt ceiling debates occurred in 2015, 15, and 17. These incidents served as a reminder that perhaps no investment is truly risk-free. So that's a good history lesson, right? All right, so given the bond's price, we can compute the bond's yield to maturity. So here they are with the zero coupon bond, and they're actually, solving for the yield to maturity based on these prices, right? Oh, okay, so hold on. So that wasn't... all right, so knowing this price, here's the yield to maturity. The 15.56 yield to maturity of the bond is much higher than the yield to maturity of the default-free Treasury bill. Okay, but this does not mean that investors who buy the bond will earn a 15.56 return. Because Avant will default, the expected return of the bond equals its 4% cost of capital. Note that the yield to maturity of a defaultable bond, and this is important, exceeds the expected return of investing in the bond. So that should be highlighted. Because we calculate the yield to maturity using the promised cash flows rather than the expected cash flows, the yield will always be higher than the expected return of investing in the bond. So that's, the promised cash flows are different than the expected cash flows, right? These are promised, but you're not necessarily going to get that. Expected, okay, means that the yield will always be higher than the expected return of investing in the bond, right? So again, so notice it says here the yield to maturity of a defaultable bond, if that exceeds the expected return of investing in the bond, so because we calculate the yield to maturity using the promised cash flows rather than the expected cash flows, the yield will always be higher than the expected return of investing in the bond. Okay? So there's a big difference between expected and promised here. So these two examples, they're extreme cases, right? And so in one case we said, okay, the default of probability, the probability of default was 0. And then in the second case, we assumed they would definitely default. In reality, the chance that Avant will default lies somewhere in between these two extremes, right? All right. So again, let's look. Consider the 1 year 0. This time, assume that the bond payoffs are certain. So in particular, there's a 50% chance that the bond will repay its face value in full, and a 50% chance the bond will default and you will receive 900. So this on average, if you take the average of 1,900, on average you will get $950. So to determine the price of this bond, we have to discount these cash flows and use a cost of capital equal to the expected return of other securities, and we got to look at other things with with equivalent risk. All right, so we got to look at those. So Avant is more likely to default if the economy is weak. So there's a function of the economy that's tying in here. So if you're going to buy a bond that's got a chance of defaulting, you're going to demand a risk premium, right? Which means their debt cost of capital, which is the expected return, will require to compensate them for the risk of the bond's cash flows will be higher than the 4% risk-free rate. All right, so let's look at let's suppose the investors demand a risk premium of 1.1 for this bond. So the appropriate cost of capital is now you add 1.1 to the 4%, which means that the price is going to be much lower, right? See, here was the price of the bond, but because this is higher, this is going to be lower. Consequently, in this case, the bond's yield to maturity is going to be 10.63%. You take this price and put it here, and the yield to maturity goes here. So the 10.63% promised yield is the most investors will receive, right? So, all right. So let me stop here, and I'll pick up over here. There's a lot of topics here in bonds. Bonds are really complicated,